everyone. I'm your host, Cam Webster, and welcome to The Art of Boring, the podcast where we dive deeper into Mawer's investment philosophy and thinking in order to help you, our listeners, become more informed investors. Ultimately, we hope to connect you with the people at Mawer who find excitement in delivering on Be Boring, Make Money. On this episode, we speak with Christian Deckart, Deputy Chief Investment Officer and Portfolio Manager on both global small cap and global equity strategies. Christian takes us on a journey through the Mawer investment philosophy by walking us through a few of the top holdings in the global small cap fund. These include Softcat, Tsuruha, XP Power, and VZ Holdings. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Any views expressed in this podcast are based upon the information available at the time and are subject to change.
Welcome to the podcast, Christian. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Cam.
What I'm really excited about today is you and I were both brokerage analysts back in the day, actually both at Merrill Lynch, which is fun. But I really enjoyed the analysis when I was an analyst, really enjoyed the talking to management teams, figuring out competitively where they think they are and all that. So today's podcast is kind of all about that. We've walked through a few examples of holdings in global small cap, and hopefully you can give us and our listeners a really good sense of why we're invested in what we're invested in global small cap. What I'm hoping listeners can get out of the podcast is how we generate ideas, the basis of our investment thesis, so business model, management teams, things like that we usually think about. But we don't want to paint a perfectly rosy picture, maybe a balanced picture. So we'll get into a little bit of risks, what can go wrong, and then kind of conclude with our rapid fire round, and hopefully we get to know you a little bit better.
Excellent. Great. Looking forward to that.
What maybe we can start with, Christian, is as Deputy CIO, you're responsible, I guess, for a bit of the process in the investment philosophy. So if you can give us a quick overview, potentially in 3 minutes or less, what Mawer's investment philosophy is, then we'll get into examples after that.
The investment philosophy we have is quite simple. It's to buy wealth-creating businesses. That means businesses that generate a return on capital above their cost of capital. We want to own these businesses when they're run by an excellent management team. So people where actions and words line up, ideally that are aligned with our interests and have a track record of good capital allocation, good execution. And finally, to really do good things for our clients, we don't only need good business models, good management teams. We also need to buy these business models at a discount to their intrinsic value or at a reasonable valuation so that it makes sense from the perspective of our clients. That's the philosophy in a nutshell, really.
What we want to do is take listeners on a journey through some of the holdings in global small cap. And we've chosen a selection, I guess, out of the top 10. So these are significant holdings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's kick it off and start with Softcat. Why don't you up front kind of give us a sense of what the business does and then run us through the investment thesis we're currently holding?
Yeah, so Softcat is based in the UK, just outside London. The technical term is they're a value-added reseller for IT products. So if you think of a business like us here, Mawer, where we would buy our software that we need in the business, or the hardware, the PCs, the printers, the other hardware we need from an IT perspective, we would buy that from a reseller like Softcat. Now, they're not here. We buy it from a Canadian one. That's the type of business that Softcat would serve. So any business that is so small that the big producers of software or hardware, take Microsoft or HP, don't want to directly sell to them because it's just too many customers, not enough volume. And so Softcat sells IT hardware and software to these small, medium-sized businesses, mainly to small, medium-sized businesses. And they add value by advising the customer on what type of product really helps them. This advice is getting increasingly complex over time because if you think back maybe 30 years ago, to be an expert in IT, you needed to understand what MS-DOS is and maybe know Microsoft Word. But today with firewall security software, different applications, there's more knowledge. So companies, large value-added resellers, have a scale advantage because they can offer all that advice and all these products out of one hand. Now, first point we've said always is that we look for a wealth-creating business. Let's go into the question if that is one and why that is one. So this business generates return on capital employed of 50%. And what do we mean when we say return on capital employed? Well, we mean the operating profit that the business generates on the capital they have to put in the business to make it run. So capital in the business would be the inventory they have to hold if they own the building in which they operate that building and so on. So Softcat is a pretty capital light business the way they've set it up. So that's why these returns on capital are roughly around 50% in the recent past.
Just pause there in terms of capital light. So a little more detail on what that means. You don't own the building, but what do you own and what do you consider in that light category? So
a business could be capital heavy once it really needs a large investment in equipment. So what would be a good example? Well, if you have to build a big factory for something that requires a lot of equipment in it, you need to buy the land, you need to build the building, that would be capital heavy. Why do we prefer capital light over capital heavy? Well, if you grow the business, then usually you would, in a capital heavy business, you would need to invest additional capital. And that is capital that the business needs to generate as profits and can't buy them back to shareholders. So we ideally want a business that can grow, but doesn't require more capital from us. So have our cake and eat it as well, if you will. So that was the wealth creating business model. And to tie that up with return on capital employed, we said it's maybe 50% in this case. What is cost of capital? Well, cost of capital is the return that those who've provided the capital to the business expect in return. So that would be right now probably a very low single-digit amount from bank loans and from shareholders. Well, long-term average, we say that shareholders probably expect returns of 7-8%, which is 6-8% is the long-term return of capital markets of stocks as well. So that's a bit the cost of capital. So you see here, 50 is a lot higher than 7-8 or the combined cost of capital. So there's a lot of wealth creation there, which is really good for shareholders because that wealth creation belongs to us, belongs to shareholders, belongs to our clients, ultimately.
So Softcat, let's just get into a little bit of how did the team come across it? How was the idea generated? How long have we owned it in the portfolio, and kind of why is it a top 10 holding?
Yeah, it's a relatively recent idea to start with that. Average hold period across the portfolios is we're very long-term investors, so it's not unusual for us to hold stocks for 5 or 10 years. This is a relatively recent idea. We bought the first stock in early 2017, if I recall correctly. We had been familiar with similar business models that are listed around the world for quite a long period of time, but had never found one that was priced so that we thought we get it at a discount to intrinsic value in the times before when we looked at it. And this one was a curious case because they had gone public in the UK, if I can recall correctly, in 2015, and the market really hadn't reacted. In our opinion, the market hadn't reacted to the sales and earnings growth the company had posted in the 1-2 years after the initial public offering, so after they went public. And so when we found it, we thought it traded at a significant discount to our estimate of intrinsic value, and so we initiated. How did we find the idea? Initially, it was this particular one was simply by going through a list of all the companies in the world that had gone public in the years 2015 and 16. And let me just add that when I say all the companies in the world that fall in the global small cap, because this is from a global small cap perspective. So all the companies in the world that had gone public in our market cap range, and we just read through the business descriptions. And this one, then looking at the valuation, just caught our eye because we were aware of the business model and other places thought of it as high quality, and this one, even at first glance, looked pretty interesting on the valuation. And then we followed our normal process, which means we sort of put it in a file and waited until we had enough other ideas to talk to benchmark it against.
Right.
And then we interviewed the management team. So in this case, we didn't travel to England. We did that later. Yeah. But at that initial stage, we just called them, arranged a call with them, talked to management, and ended up being very impressed by what they've built in terms of corporate culture, in terms of also in terms of their track record, what they've built in the business, and what they do for customers. And so, we initiated a position relatively quickly, actually, for us. Often we will watch businesses for a long period of time until we're confident enough. But with this one, because we had seen similar business models in the past, we were relatively quick to add that one.
So just to round out on maybe Softcat is quickly, what I think might be interesting is why don't we cover where do they have competitive advantage and why?
That's a great
right?
question.
So
yeah.
And then maybe what can go wrong? Like for me, I'm thinking, well, what if Microsoft decides, well, we're just going to distribute direct to customers? Would that box them completely out of the markets they compete in? So let's cover that.
So two questions. Let me start with the competitive advantage, and let me tie that up to what we said earlier, wealth creating business.
Right.
So in a free market economy, businesses shouldn't be able to create wealth in the long run, because if they did, competitors would come in and try to gain share and take away that wealth creation. So we actually need, as long-term shareholders, that competitive advantage to protect these high returns on capital, that wealth creation for shareholders. Often we find that a competitive advantage just in the shape of some sort of cost advantage or some sort of sticky customers. So customers that have a preference to stick to one supplier, almost despite the price that they charge. And what we have here is, Softcat is one of the largest players in this field in the UK. So they enjoy meaningful purchasing advantages, rebates as they're called in the IT industry.
Mm-hmm.
So that matters to them, and it's difficult for a smaller competitor who buys a lot less to compete with these rebates, because you need to convince your suppliers that for some reason they should give you similar rebates for buying a lot less.
Okay, and they only compete in the UK?
They only compete in the UK,
business.
yes,
Okay.
right now. Preference, sticky customers. We've actually also interviewed our own IT people here internally, and we always do that. Scuttlebutt, as we call it. We try to talk to customers, competitive suppliers, or to customers of similar businesses. So we do a lot. But here, one very simple one was just to go across the floor and ask. And what we found is that there is actually a fair degree of trust involved in this business for buying your equipment, buying the software, making sure it comes from a legitimate source, and that there's someone you can call and reach anytime when something doesn't go right.
Okay.
You know, the saying, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, that comes out of the IT industry, because if a computer is down and not running in a business like this, and I'm really using our business here as an example, but there's a huge downside to it. So in many businesses, people will not take a risk on a computer, which for many people today is their main work tool.
Yeah.
So that leads to customer stickiness. So we said maybe a small advantage on the cost side, some stickiness of the customers. So that helps to defend these returns. Your second question was, what can go wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Upgrading something. I'm making up that example, but that's not the type of stuff they want to deal with. So we also get comfort, by the way, just on this risk, because this is an industry structure that's been in place for decades. So this is not cutting edge of technology. This is actually pretty old economy, if you will. Other risks are deterioration of culture, because it's a sales culture. If you will, it's a bit a simple statement to say it's a people business, but people are important in this business. So if your culture deteriorates from what it is, we think they have an excellent culture. So if it deteriorates from there, that might impair.
All right. So
the business.
The thesis, what I'm hearing, Christian, is the thesis is built on organic growth.
Yeah.
And that organic growth is tied, largely speaking, to salespeople.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
So what kind of tool might you use to evaluate? I mean, you're going to ask the management team, how's your sales team? Oh, it's great. Okay, well, thank you, management team. You gave me an answer. How do I evaluate that? How do I step out of a management interview and evaluate whether that sales culture is good?
So that's what we call Scuttlebutt, our independent sources. So the idea of trying to talk to customers, competitors, suppliers. In this case, to quote some simple tools that we could do is Glassdoor is a website, at least in the English-speaking world, where employees put their experience with their employer on. So you can look at the Glassdoor ratings if there's enough reviews on it, and then obviously have to benchmark that against other competitors. That's usually what tells you more. So not the absolute number. You see how do they do against other people. So you need to know names of competitors. And then also you can benchmark a business against its own past, which is a good comparison. So just where are trends going. And then you can look at things like employee fluctuation. You can look at net promoter score of customers. And you can look for online reviews. Actually, a lot of stuff is online today. So you can find people that complain about the interaction they had with their suppliers. So these are all tools to get some independent information about businesses.
Good. So I think we got enough on Softcat there. So thanks for walking us through Softcat. I guess what we want to do is step from the UK and into Japan.
Island hopping.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. Little vacation. No, not a vacation. So let's talk about Tsuruha.
Okay. Yeah. Tsuruha is a business we've owned for longer, actually, now. Top of my head, probably 3-4 years. First of all, what does the business do? So it's the largest drugstore chain in Japan. Are they wealth creating? Well, they're generating returns on capital of 20%. You remember the concept. It's a measure of how much the business does good things for shareholders.
Right.
Yeah, that's significantly above the cost of capital. So there is some wealth creation. Why is there wealth creation here with Tsuruha? Well, I said already they're the largest in Japan, but there's another aspect of that. They have focused on a few regions where they try to go for local dominance, so really be significantly larger than the other competitors. And that local dominance gives them cost advantages in marketing. So if you think of advertising, also in logistics, because stores need to be supplied from a warehouse. Also gives advantage in purchasing. So again, purchasing conditions.
So how would the Japanese structure in drugstores compare to, can I describe Tsuruha as the Shoppers Drug Mart of Japan?
I do not know enough about the fragmentation of the Canadian market. My observation from Calgary is there's not much choice here. I don't think we've ever bought anything other than a Shoppers Drug Mart in the 5 years that I've lived here.
Okay.
So I would describe the Canadian market, but please, Canadian listeners, forgive me if I get a wrong impression here on the Canadian market, but it seems not very fragmented here, while in Japan, the market is still fairly fragmented, with Tsuruha being the largest, but they only have a 9% market share, and the top 10 players only hold market share of maybe close to 60%. So there's still a large tail of smaller competitors against which they have then, if we talk about scale, more significant advantages.
Right. You just described a fragmented market, and I presume Tsuruha is trying to grow by acquisition.
They are partly doing that. Partly they are just gaining market shares through openings of new stores in regions where they try to get to that dominance, yes.
Let's hear a little bit about how this idea was generated. How did it eventually make it to the portfolio?
It was an idea that was a good example of how we work together at Mawer as a team. So it's in the global small cap portfolio, but it was initially an idea of the international equity team. So they found it first, if you will. So some healthy competition here. They were faster than us. Well, when we put something on the platform, if you will, so if one funded more buys it, obviously the others look at it as well. Mm-hmm. And so we decided to join them, a few years back. And then we've increased our position a few times after.
Right. So there's a bit of back and forth. I mean, there's some global small cap names that are now in global equity and vice versa. So that's a good example.
And that works. If I may add that, that's important. That works because we all across the team, across all the asset classes, we share the same investment philosophy. So what I described here with wealth creating business, excellent management team, buying a discount to intrinsic value, we all share that same philosophy. And we also all use the same tools to value businesses, to judge management, and so on. We use the same frameworks. We're really one team.
How reliant are we in the investment thesis on them being successful?
So there's an interesting thought here. Generally, when we look at management, action speaks louder than words. So we often look at their deeds over time, and also how they compare to what they said, and also at their incentive structure. So here in the case of Tsuruha, we have the interesting situation that there's actually a family by the family name of Tsuruha that is involved in the business and runs it. And also the business is part of what one can call an alliance with other drugstores in Japan that are mostly active in other regions. And so some of them are also family run. And so they sit on each other's board, hold shares in each other. And so, if you will, they control each other as well.
So you're viewing that as a good governance kind of structure where if one family's on the other's board, then...
you can, yes, and they have cross holdings. If they were just on each other's boards without being financially incented, we might do that differently.
Right.
But in this case, we also see this as a positive. Yes, yeah, that's the management situation. So engaged managers who, given that it's a family business, they're likely to be around for a long period of time and not to be job hoppers. So that's something we view as positive.
A few risks with Tsuruha. What would be the major risks in the investment?
Regulation is one that's obviously on top of the list. 25% roughly 25% of the revenue is from prescription drugs. So prescription drug prices are regulated or mandated in most parts of the world, in Japan as well. So any regulatory change, any government change into that. With an aging population like you have in Japan, that's a two-edged sword because it's positive because it should drive demand for drugs and pharmacies and drugstores. On the other side, well, the payer in the end often is the government or all the taxpayers. So there's pressure against that. Then one aspect that you mentioned that you just brought up, and I want to pick up is, we like engaged owners, but there's of course a risk in we trust these people and we think of them highly. But if we were wrong on our assessment, then in a situation like this, it can have large downsides if you were to discover that something is not quite right in the governance structure, or change would be tough to bring about. Although I'll flag that's not our business model. But
so you mentioned something called deeds and tracking deeds. So what somebody says and what somebody does is, I'm paraphrasing, but would that be a way that in Tsuruha's case you would say, well, last quarter they said this and this quarter it didn't happen. Therefore, there's some red flags that come up. So we were just talking about, yes, we have to trust these people. But if there's an inconsistency in their deeds, then...
I see what you mean. So it probably wouldn't get too hung up on quarters, because a quarter, many things can happen. We're there for the long run. But one good example, particularly in Japan, would probably be returns on equity or returns on capital employed, where a lot of companies now start talking about, we want to bring up our return on equity or return on capital, and then the targets and what they achieve aren't that impressive from our perspective. Here we have historically returns on capital of around 20%. So here we have a business that has generated really good returns for shareholders in the past. So we value that, what they've achieved, higher than if someone just says, we're intending to have that one day. So here that's a deed that we can just look at, and that gives us reassurance in this case.
Great. So that's Tsuruha, Japanese drugstore chain growing regionally, I guess. Now we're going to switch gears, going to island hop again back to the UK and talk about a company called XP Power. So give us, Christian, a little sense of what they do, maybe what their competitive advantage is, and we'll go from there.
It's a good example, actually, of a global small cap investment because it is a very global business. So they're listed in the UK, have large operations in Singapore. Actually, we visited these operations in the not too
I'm sensing a theme here, another island.
Another island, if you will, yes. So I said UK listed, significant operations in Asia, but 53% of revenue is from North America. So maybe an example of, where global investing can take us, and also of the difficulty, by the way, of bucketing this company as a UK company as opposed to a Singaporean company or a US business, but 53% of business from North America. What do? They design, manufacture, and distribute power converters. So when you think of the electricity that comes out of the grid, that's often not the electricity that some piece of equipment in industry or in healthcare needs. And so you need a converter to get that to the type of voltage energy that the equipment really
So in a sense, from a big transmission tower into a device.
But in the device. So the converter they do go into the device, they're built in, which leads to a nice aspect of the business that a lot of it is, not sure you can call it recurring, but reoccurring. If one of these converters has been designed into a device, say into a medical piece of equipment, then it's unlikely that the producer of that medical piece of equipment will change the supplier of the converter during the lifetime of that piece of equipment. So there is an aspect of recurring here. We were impressed with their market position. Actually, 90% of XP Power's revenues comes from, according to our estimates, comes from markets where they are number one or number two. So that's a pretty...
That high a percentage?
Pretty high number, yeah.
That's unique. So XP Power sounds like they have a really good business in terms of you describing number one or number two market share in a large proportion of their revenue. My curiosity around that is, How sustainable is that? I think we talk a lot about sustainable competitive advantage. So let's use XP Power as an example to walk through that.
There's a few aspects. First of all, there's no guarantees on this, right? We make, if you will, our assessment of competitive advantage, and future competitive advantage is always an estimate, and we try to gather as much data as we can, and they make an estimate, and we need to get it right most of the time, but we don't get it right all of the time. So what are the data points we're looking here in this case? So I've mentioned that a lot of the products are designed into other products, so they share the same life cycle. So that leads to some reoccurrence of the business and therefore also stability of market share. Secondly is if you think of the position of the customer. So the power converter is pretty critical for the piece of equipment to work. Obviously, if there's no power, the equipment is not going to work anymore. Our research has indicated that maybe 1 to 2% of the cost of the equipment is that power converter. So it's relatively small. But if it fails, well, then the whole equipment stops. So if something is mission critical, but has a low cost, then usually people tend to experiment less with changing suppliers than if it was less important or was a higher price point. And then also there's this qualification cycle here. So because it needs to be designed in, there's back and forth between engineers on both sides. So our assessment is there's also relationships involved in this and trust.
So in relationship between XP Power and their clients.
And the clients,
got an engineer on both sides and they're collaborating and going, well,
exactly.
Try this, tweak, try that. That's okay, that makes more sense. That's sustainable, I guess. In XP Power's case, you've got, my understanding is high voltage is AC and low voltage is DC. So we have AC DC. Would you put XP Power, and this is going to be really cheesy, but here we go. Are they back in black, thunderstruck, or on the highway to hell as an investment?
Now I have to make sure I don't laugh. So I don't think they're a highway to hell. I hope their customers don't get thunderstruck. And if you remind me of the third alternative, I hope I can say something.
Back in black.
Back in black. They have been in the black. So being profitable, definitely since we've owned it. So not yes to all three, but I said something at least to all three.
Yeah, that's great. I think listeners will appreciate that. So we'll move on to our last holding. It's VZ Holdings. It's a Swiss company, so we're going inland now, landlocked.
An island surrounded by the European Union, if you will, but
there
yes.
You go. We got the island analogy in there. So what do they do? How long have we owned it? Where did we find the idea? Same kind of drill here.
It's a holding we've actually had for, I would say, at least 5 years. Background of the business is it's an exceptional Swiss banking model because they have not relied on exporting Swiss banking. It's a domestic business, historically at least. So they're there to serve Swiss people. And to use a bit of catchphrase here, they are a robo-advisor in New Talk, or they have been one for a long period of time. So they do passive investments mainly for their customers. Who's the average customers? Well, Switzerland is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And so it's for wealthy Swiss people as they approach retirement. Then often by that time, they will have heard of VZ a lot because VZ advertise a lot. They have a magazine that they send out to a large number of Swiss households dealing with questions like retirement, how to plan your estate, tax questions, things like that. So Swiss people are aware that there's competence in these questions with VZ. And then as the founder came from McKinsey, he brought a different model to this industry. At first, people go there for advice for fee. So they say, we're 50, 52, me and my wife, and we want this or that, and this is our mortgage still we have on the house, and how can we tax structure that, and what could we do better there? And then VZ will consult them for a fee, an hourly fee, so a classical consultant model. And once the plan is made, VZ will say, and by the way, if you want, we can transfer you to our wealth management unit, and you can have all this implemented here, but there's no need for that.
So it's advice up front.
For
a fee.
And then a decision point. Yeah. Decision point, do you want to stick with us or transfer to that other unit in-house, or you want to go independent? So it's an interesting way because they can charge the customers for the marketing, if you will, for the marketing stage, but they gain customers from that. But not everyone that does this converts to a client. And I think that's important for the integrity of model. They have it that way and keep it that way. So if you get advisor, you can also take the plan and just take it somewhere else. You've paid for it.
Right. So locally focused, so Swiss only.
Was Swiss only. Ventured out to Germany probably 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago. Right. Germany's not a significant part of the operations. They're growing slow organically, trial and error method, and so it's not a large part of the operations, but it's there. It could be potentially one day a bridgehead to doing more in the European Union, but they're taking it slow.
My sense is the way you describe it is that that's a pretty unique model. Are there other competitors trying to mimic that? I mean, it's been around for a long time, so if they've been successful, are there other competitors mimicking that now?
I mean, the idea is, in our opinion, pretty good, but there's nothing protectable in the idea itself. Probably mode there could come from culture, so that you have that culture of independent advice, not hard selling in the beginning of the process. But I think other people are trying to imitate that, have imitated that, and I don't think that's where the moat comes from. Tsuruha Holdings now has a pretty strong market position in Switzerland, so there is scale advantages there in that, in that publication, for instance, in that customer magazine they have, in the density of the branch network they have, because yes, their customer group likes online banking, but they maybe also don't mind seeing someone from time to time, so really go into a branch and meeting people. By the way, this is a good example of something we have in other investments as well. The CEO running it founded the business now, 25, 30 years ago. So he had that idea coming out of McKinsey, just had that idea, and he's taken that idea, that vision, and taken it to a significant player in the Swiss banking market. So this is one of the, I find, beautiful things in investing in global small caps, just seeing entrepreneurs, what they've built, what they've achieved, and as global small cap investors, we have the privilege to co-invest when these people list the work of their lifetime at the stock exchange. We can co-invest and partner with them.
With VZ, what would be the toughest question you're asking management right now?
The toughest question we're asking management, what they experience in Switzerland is some fee pressure and step up in the competitive environment in Switzerland. If you think of what's happened to the Swiss banks over the last 10 years in terms of how they've become tax compliant or had they issues with tax compliance, a lot of the Swiss banks now prefer to focus on the domestic market again and are going away from the offshore business. So as they focus on the domestic business again, well, they see who's strong. They're VZ. So they're, of course, becoming more of a competitive issue there. So that is something that is surely a topic we follow up with management and that we monitor closely. And our assessment of the moat could, the competitive advantage, over time we have to update that and see how the data points come in and what our scuttlebutt reveals about how that is.
So we've covered 4 of the top 10 holdings in global small cap. Hope listeners have gotten a sense of the detail in terms of how we approach these investments. Thank you for walking us through that, Christian. I think that's a good way to round out the full conversation, other than to lead into the rapid fire round of questions. And these, you may find these a little more personal, but so right off the bat, small cap or large cap, and why?
Well, I've done both over my career. So small caps are good for learning because they're often less complex. There's only one business unit. Large caps are more around themes, around trends. There's also more material to read, so they can be a lot of fun as well. So I've most enjoyed when there was a mix of both.
Favorite German expression and proper translation?
So that takes me back to my university days. It's Empfängerhorizont. Can you say that, Cam? Empfängerhorizont?
No.
Okay. Okay. Empfängerhorizont. So it's the horizon of the recipient of information. So it's a one German word for transporting a very long mental model.
That's one German word?
Yes. Empfängerhorizont.
Yeah.
The horizon of the recipient of information. So it's the mental model of if you say something, if you communicate something, what is the horizon of the recipient of that information? So how will the recipient of that information understand it? How would an objective recipient of the information understand it? It's a mental model, once you think about that has implications when you try to talk to your children and explain them something, when you talk to your wife, or when you look at a stock and ask yourself how the stock market is going to react to a particular piece of news. So always put yourself in the shoes of the listener, if you will.
Gotcha.
Brings it back to the podcast.
Good stuff. What's one of the most insightful things you've learned from your children?
That question goes back to the Empfängerhorizont, the horizon of the recipient of information. So I'm sorry, Cam, you told me a few weeks ago you were glad that I didn't bring up the German-Canadian hockey game, but so now I'm sorry I have to. Wow. I watched that game. We don't usually have the TV running for breakfast, but that morning we did actually. You might know that we don't even have a TV in our living room, so it was on my iPhone, and I was curious to look into the game, Germany-Canada, and my oldest daughter, 4 years old, looked with me and watched with me, and we started in the middle of the game. Obviously, we just did next to breakfast, and so Germany scored, and I'm sorry for everyone, listeners in the room, I of course cheered when Germany scored, and my daughter looked at me and said, why are you cheering for Germany? It came from another planet to her. So, again, the horizon of the recipient of the information from her perspective, that was not understandable. Why that he would cheer for a country on the other side of the planet. So that is an insightful thing I learned recently. Just another application of that mental model of always think of the recipient of the information.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing something that personal with us, and thanks for spending so much time with us on Global Small Cap and walking us through some of the holdings.
Pleasure.
Hey everyone, Cam here again. To subscribe to the Art of Boring podcast, go to Mawer, that's mawer.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on iTunes, which will help more people discover the Be Boring, Make Money philosophy. Again, thanks for listening.